You know, there comes a moment, quiet, almost invisible, when you feel something inside you beginning to pull apart. Not violently, not with the dramatic shattering most stories promise, but with a soft tearing at the edges of your understanding, as if a truth you've been running from has finally caught up and placed its hand gently on your shoulder. And in that moment, you realize something unsettling. That closure, the thing you've spent months or even years chasing, was never the real medicine you needed, because closure is simply a door someone else decides to shut, while understanding is the room you build inside yourself, brick by brick, from all the pieces you once wished you could throw away. And as you stand on the threshold of this realization, you begin to ask yourself questions you've avoided for far too long. Questions about who you've become, who you pretend to be, and the quiet ache beneath your ribs that keeps whispering to you that life is not done teaching you yet. You tell yourself that if you just had one last conversation, one final explanation, one satisfying ending, maybe you could move on, maybe you could breathe. Maybe your chest would loosen and you would finally be free. But deep down, you sense that this is a comforting illusion, because the truth is that closure depends on someone else admitting their part, speaking the words you need, feeling the things you hope, and rarely do people cooperate with the needs of your healing. So the paradox is this: you've been waiting for an ending from someone who has already left the story, while ignoring the deeper truth waiting quietly inside you. What you really seek is understanding, the kind that doesn't require permission or apology, the kind that doesn't depend on another person turning back toward you, but instead on you turning inward toward the parts of yourself you've avoided. And maybe that's why you're here, because some part of you is tired of carrying the weight of unfinished chapters, tired of expecting another person to give meaning to your pain, tired of feeling powerless in moments where you desperately want to feel whole. And so, the question rises slowly, like dawn. What if you don't need closure to move on? What if all you need is the courage to understand what happened, why it shaped you, and how you can reclaim your story without waiting for someone else to rewrite the ending? And as this question settles into your mind, you might notice something shifting deep within you. Maybe fear, maybe relief, maybe both. Because understanding demands something more difficult than closure. It requires that you stop running. And when you stop running, you start to see things you couldn't see before. Things about your daily life, your habits, your patterns, the invisible ways you distract yourself from yourself. You start noticing how much of your life unfolds in autopilot, how easily you slip into roles you didn't choose, but learn to perform, how often you smile when you're hurting, how often you say, "It's fine," when it isn't, how often you pretend to be strong because you're afraid your softness will be misunderstood, or worse, ignored. You begin to realize that most people around you are living in a kind of gentle sleepwalking, laughing at jokes that don't touch them, scrolling through lives they don't live, pursuing goals they didn't choose, and numbing themselves with noise, movement, distraction, anything to avoid sitting alone with the truth of who they are. And you too have lived in this illusion, the illusion that busyness equals purpose, that emotional numbness equals strength, that silence equals peace. Until one day the illusion cracks, usually in the simplest of moments. A quiet walk home, a conversation that unexpectedly cuts deep, a memory that resurfaces without warning, or the sudden heaviness that arrives when you realize you don't recognize yourself anymore. And in that moment, the veil lifts just enough for you to glimpse the truth, that you've been living with a kind of emotional inertia, pulled forward by expectations, obligations, old wounds, and stories that never belonged to you. You begin to see the subtle performances happening everywhere. The co-worker who laughs too loudly to hide their loneliness, the friend who gives advice they cannot take themselves, the family member who tries to control everything because they fear losing anything, the partner who withdraws not out of cruelty, but out of fear that their vulnerability will be used against them. You begin to see all the ways people try to protect themselves, even when they hurt one another in the process. And as you observe this, gently, quietly, you realize something else, that you too have harmed yourself through misunderstanding, through expectations, through trying to be who others needed instead of who you truly are. And suddenly, the world becomes a little sadder, a little softer, a little more honest, as if the noise has dimmed and only the essential remains. This is the beginning of awakening, not a grand spiritual event, not a cinematic transformation, but a quiet noticing, a shift in perception where reality becomes sharper, clearer, more uncomfortable, and more beautiful all at once. And once this awakening begins, it becomes impossible to return to the unconscious comfort you once lived in, because now you see too much, you feel too much, you understand too much, and the truth, once seen, demands to be lived. And as this quiet awakening settles deeper into you, you begin to see the illusion woven through the everyday. The illusion that people are what they present, that the surface tells the truth, that the world is as simple as it pretends to be. And suddenly you notice how fragile the masks are, how easily they crack with the slightest pressure, how desperately people cling to identities that were never truly theirs, identities shaped by childhood echoes, societal demands, old wounds disguised as personality traits, and fears masquerading as preferences. You start seeing it everywhere, at the dinner table where everyone speaks but no one listens, where each person rehearses their thoughts instead of receiving the moment, at gatherings where people smile with their mouths but not their eyes, where laughter becomes a currency traded to avoid vulnerability, at workplaces where everyone pretends they know what they're doing while silently fearing they'll be exposed, in families that operate like old scripts no one has edited, each member playing a role so outdated it barely fits, yet no one dares to rewrite it. And perhaps the strangest part is that once you see these illusions, they begin to lose their power, because illusions survive through participation. And when you stop participating in the performance, you create a small rupture in the collective trance. You stop responding out of obligation. You stop smoothing every rough edge. You stop shrinking yourself to make others comfortable. And suddenly, the world reacts, sometimes with confusion, sometimes with resistance, sometimes with admiration, because your refusal to play the game exposes the game for what it is. You begin to understand that most human behaviour is not conscious choice but inherited habit, not freedom but conditioning, not authenticity but adaptation. People aren't cruel because they want to be, they're cruel because they're afraid. People don't withdraw because they don't care, they withdraw because they don't know how to stay. People don't hurt you because you deserved it, they hurt you because they're repeating a pattern older than you, older than them, older than the silence that followed every wound they never healed. And when you understand this, not intellectually, but emotionally, something changes in you. A sadness, yes, but also a strange tenderness, a quiet compassion that doesn't excuse the harm, but sees the human beneath the behaviour. And yet with this tenderness comes a kind of heaviness, because seeing the world clearly is not easy. It comes with a cost, the cost of losing the comforting illusions that once held you together. But losing illusions is not the same as losing hope. If anything, it is the beginning of finding a more honest hope, a hope rooted not in pretending, but in understanding. And then, without warning, comes the moment of true awakening. Part 3. The moment that feels less like enlightenment and more like a slow collapse of everything you once believed to be stable. The moment where you realize that the person you've been searching for, the one who will finally apologize, explain, validate, and close the chapter, simply doesn't exist. because the closure you wanted was never theirs to give. You feel the truth rise inside you like a tide you can't hold back. No conversation will undo the past. No explanation will erase the pain. No apology will return the version of you that existed before the loss, the betrayal, the disappointment, the abandonment. And as this realization settles, you feel a quiet ache, not sharp, but deep, as if your chest has become a room filled with echoes of moments you still haven't fully lived through. You feel the heaviness of everything you've been carrying. Unanswered questions, unfinished sentences, emotional debts no one will ever repay, memories that refuse to fade, fantasies of closure that always end the same way, with you waiting for someone who has already walked out of the story. And in that moment, you understand something profound. Your suffering did not come from what happened, but from what you expected after it happened. You expected understanding from someone who didn't understand themselves. You expected accountability from someone who couldn't face their own actions. You expected maturity from someone still battling their childhood shadows. You expected them to meet you at the depth you offered, forgetting that not everyone breathes at the same emotional altitude. And this realization stings. It burns even, because it forces you to confront the truth that much of your pain came from hoping someone could give you what they were never capable of giving. But this is where awakening becomes powerful, not when you judge them, but when you see clearly that their limitations do not have to become your cage. Awakening is the moment you stop waiting for someone else to heal you. It is the moment you realize that understanding, not closure, is what sets you free. Understanding that people love according to their capacity, not your worth. Understanding that endings do not require permission. Understanding that letting go is not a failure, but a form of wisdom. Understanding that your heart can break and still remain open, not because you are weak, but because you are choosing to live honestly instead of hiding behind emotional armor. And with this awakening comes a subtle shift, not loud, not dramatic, but undeniable, like a door inside you opening quietly, letting in a light you didn't know you were allowed to receive. It is the beginning of becoming someone new, not because you changed suddenly, but because you finally saw what has always been true, that you don't need closure to heal. You need the courage to understand your experience without expecting anyone else to validate it. And once you understand, you begin to reclaim your power piece by piece, breath by breath, moment by moment. And once that awakening takes hold, once you start seeing people clearly, seeing their fears, their patterns, their emotional limits, you will begin to experience a strange and heavy phase that almost every deeply aware person goes through. A phase we rarely talk about because it's uncomfortable, because it exposes a side of growth that isn't glamorous or inspiring. Isolation. Not physical isolation, though that too may happen, but an emotional and spiritual isolation that comes from realizing how few people are truly capable of meeting you at the depth where you now stand. You start noticing the silence between words, the intentions behind actions, the wounds behind defenses, and suddenly conversations feel different, lighter on the surface, yet heavier underneath, as if you're listening to the echoes of what people aren't saying more than the words they are. You feel yourself drifting slightly outside the world you once fit comfortably inside, like a person standing just behind the glass of a window, watching life unfold, but not entirely participating in it. And maybe for the first time, you understand what it means to be deeply aware, to see the truth in others that they themselves are not ready to see. But awareness is a double-edged sword. It gives you clarity, but it also burdens you with perception. It allows you to love deeply, but it also forces you to feel the fractures in people's hearts before they admit they're breaking. It gives you wisdom, but it takes away the innocence of not knowing. And this loss of innocence creates a kind of emotional solitude that can feel like exile, even when you're surrounded by people. You might find yourself growing quieter, not out of sadness, but out of comprehension. You might withdraw from conversations that used to excite you because now they feel hollow. You might find that the people you once confided in no longer understand you, not because they don't care, but because they can't follow you into the depth you've entered. And so you begin to carry your insight like a lantern in a dark room, lighting the space around you, but realizing that not everyone wants to walk toward the light with you. Some cling to their familiar darkness because it feels safer than confronting the truth. Some avoid your presence because your clarity makes them uncomfortable, as if your understanding exposes their unspoken fears. Some grow distant, not because you change too much, but because they change too little. And in this stage of isolation, you might think something is wrong with you, that you've become too sensitive, too intense, too aware, too much. But in reality, you are simply shedding illusions faster than others, and shedding illusions often looks like losing people, losing habits, losing environments, losing versions of yourself you once clung to tightly. You begin to grieve these silent losses, losses no one else sees, losses that don't come with funerals or farewells. You grieve the way friendships fade when you outgrow shared delusions. You grieve the way relationships shift when you stop accepting crumbs of connection. You grieve the way family dynamics unravel when you finally stop playing the role assigned to you. And perhaps the deepest grief of all is the grief of self-recognition, the realization that the person you are becoming feels unfamiliar, even to you. But within this grief, something important is taking shape, the foundation for a healthier, clearer, more grounded version of you, one that is not built on illusions, one that does not require validation to feel real, one that knows how to walk alone without feeling abandoned. And it is in this isolation that you learn a profound truth. Awareness doesn't distance you from people. It reveals who can walk beside you. It doesn't make you lonely. It shows you who is capable of true connection. It doesn't make you cold. It teaches you the difference between warmth and dependency. And slowly, quietly, you begin to realize that this isolation is not punishment. It is purification. It strips away everything false so that you can finally understand everything true. But with isolation comes a new kind of conflict. Part 5, the conflict between what you now see and what you feel responsible for. Because once you understand people deeply, you face a dilemma no one warned you about. Should you speak the truth you see, or should you remain silent and let others continue their illusions? Should you intervene when you recognize someone is hurting themselves, or should you allow them to learn through their own path, even if that path leads to suffering? Should you express what you feel, knowing it may be misunderstood, or should you swallow your truth for the sake of peace? This conflict becomes a quiet storm inside you. You see the patterns that others are blind to. You see the emotional wounds they reenact unconsciously. You see the ways they sabotage themselves, the ways they project, the ways they run from their own reflection. But you also understand that people can only receive truth at the level of awareness they currently inhabit. And so you begin to wrestle with questions that have no easy answers. If you say nothing, are you enabling their dysfunction? If you speak honestly, are you crossing a boundary and taking responsibility for a lesson they haven't chosen? If you stay silent, are you betraying your own authenticity? If you speak, are you forcing awakening onto someone who isn't ready? And all the while, you feel the emotional stakes rising, the tension in relationships, the strain in conversations, the unspoken pressure of holding knowledge you cannot always share. You begin to understand why so many emotionally aware people choose silence, not because they are afraid, but because they have learned that truth, when delivered to someone unprepared, becomes a weapon instead of a gift. But silence comes with its own cost. swallowed emotions, withheld truth, the ache of being misunderstood. And so you stand in this internal conflict, torn between your wisdom and your compassion, between honesty and restraint, between intervention and acceptance. And this tension becomes the crucible through which your emotional maturity is forged. It is here, in this conflict, that you begin to understand the difference between responsibility and self-sacrifice, between helping and rescuing, between loving someone and carrying their wounds as your own. And though this conflict is painful, it is necessary, because it prepares you for the next stage, the stage where the weight of understanding becomes too heavy to bear alone, leading you inevitably toward collapse, transformation, and eventually revelation. And then, inevitably, the weight becomes too much, and you reach part 6, the collapse. Not the dramatic collapse portrayed in movies, but the quiet internal unraveling that only you can see. The kind that arrives slowly at first, then all at once, like a wave that has travelled thousands of miles just to break gently against your shore. It begins with exhaustion, a bone-deep tiredness that no amount of sleep can touch, because it's not your body that's tired, it's your soul, worn from carrying the emotional truths you never asked to hold. You feel scattered inside yourself, as if your thoughts are 1,000 birds taking flight at once, each one trying to escape the cage of a mind that has become too full, too perceptive, too burdened with understanding. You start forgetting things you once remembered easily, not because you're careless, but because your mind is overstimulated with insight. Too many conclusions, too many realizations, too many internal observations happening all at once. Your heart feels swollen, stretched thin between compassion and pain, understanding and frustration, and you begin to feel as if you have absorbed the emotional gravity of everyone around you, as if their weight has become yours. This collapse is not loud, it is subtle. You become less talkative, you move more slowly, you stare at walls longer than you used to. You start waking up with a heaviness that has no clear source. And sometimes, without warning, you cry. Not because something happened, but because nothing happened. Because everything is happening inside you all the time, and you have nowhere to place it. You begin to feel like your awareness is both a blessing and a burden. Blessing because you see clearly, burden because you feel everything too deeply. And somewhere in the middle of this emotional fatigue, you ask yourself, why me? Why am I the one who sees, who understands, who feels? But the question itself reveals the truth. You're not collapsing because you're weak. You're collapsing because you're shedding layers of yourself that can no longer survive at your new level of awareness. You're collapsing because your old identity is dissolving, and dissolution always feels like death before it feels like rebirth. You're collapsing because it's the only way for something new to rise. And into this collapse comes the beginning of part 7, revelation. It arrives quietly, almost imperceptibly, the way dawn sneaks up on the world before the sun finally breaks the horizon. You start to realize that the collapse wasn't the end. It was the clearing, the emptying, the preparation for new understanding. You begin to see that you cannot save people from themselves, not because you don't love them, but because saving someone is not the same as supporting them, and carrying someone is not the same as walking with them. You begin to understand that boundaries are not walls. They are doors you learn to keep closed when someone cannot enter without harming the space inside you. You begin to understand that letting go isn't abandonment, it's alignment, a return to what is healthy, necessary, and true. You begin to see that your sensitivity, your awareness, your depth, they are not curses. They are your compass, your sharpened intuition, your emotional intelligence, the very qualities that will lead you to the life you're meant to live. And with this revelation comes a softening, not toward others, but toward yourself. You stop blaming yourself for loving too deeply. You stop criticizing yourself for noticing what others ignore. You stop punishing yourself for not being able to shrink into the version of you that people preferred. You begin to understand that self-respect isn't built by demanding closure from others. It's built by giving understanding to yourself. You realize that closure is a myth we were taught to chase, as if someone else's words hold the power to end our story. But revelation shows you the truth. The only closure you will ever need is acceptance. Accepting what happened, accepting what didn't, accepting who someone was capable of being, accepting who you were then and who you are now. Acceptance is not surrender, it's liberation. It allows you to stop waiting for explanations that will never come, to stop rehearsing conversations that will never happen, to stop giving emotional authority to people who no longer have a place in your heart. And slowly, piece by piece, you begin reclaiming your energy, your clarity, your inner ground. You begin speaking more gently to yourself. You begin protecting your peace without feeling guilty. You begin offering compassion without abandoning yourself. And you begin seeing that the pain you carried was not a sign of brokenness. It was a sign of depth, of capacity, of love. And so we enter part 8, the integration, the moment where everything you've learned begins to weave itself into who you are, not as a temporary insight, but as a lived truth. Integration is not dramatic. It is steady, consistent, almost quiet. It's the moment you realize you can think of the past without flinching. It's the moment you no longer feel the need to rewrite the ending. It's the moment you can hold both the hurt and the wisdom in the same breath and feel at peace. You begin to move differently, more grounded, more intentional, more present. You stop explaining yourself to people who are committed to misunderstanding you. You stop seeking validation from people who are emotionally unavailable. You stop giving your time to situations that drain you, and you start choosing differently, choosing presence over performance, choosing sincerity over harmony, choosing truth over comfort, choosing understanding over closure. You begin to realize that life is not about avoiding pain, but about learning how to transform it. You begin to realize that the people who left were not endings, but catalysts. You begin to realize that the version of you who begged for closure was doing the best they could with the emotional tools they had. And you begin to see how all the phases, the illusion, the awakening, the isolation, the conflict, the collapse, the revelation, were not detours, but essential steps in your becoming. You no longer chase closure because you see clearly now. Closure is external, but understanding is internal. Closure depends on someone else, but understanding depends only on you. Closure ends a story, but understanding transforms it. And as you settle into this truth, a sense of quiet peace fills your chest. Not the peace of ignorance, not the peace of avoidance, but the peace of alignment, the peace of emotional maturity, the peace of having finally come home to yourself. And maybe, just maybe, for the first time in a long time, you feel light again. Not because the world changed, but because you did.